Hey guys, Break has been in an awkward place, to put it lightly, and as someone who's mained E2 Firefly since her release, I've been wondering exactly why that is. Because, well, there's a lot more to Break's current problems than just enemy toughness values rising. But first, in order to understand Break, we need to understand how Break and Super Break damage works. Note that I'll be referring to elements and types interchangeably. For the purposes of this video, they'll mean the same thing. Starting with the basics, practically all enemies possess toughness bars, indicated by the white bar above their heads, as well as their weakness types, indicated by the elements above their heads. Attacking enemies with an element that matches one of their weakness types, or ignores weakness types altogether, reduces their toughness by a fixed value assigned to that attack, with a special horizontal effect to indicate if the toughness would be reduced to 0. This toughness value is something you can actually check both in battle and out of battle inside the character info screen. You can also check on the enemies and see how much toughness they have in battle at any point during your character's turns. Reducing an enemy's toughness to 0 breaks the enemy, which not only deals break damage based on the enemy's max toughness, but also delays their action by 25%, and has a 150% base chance to apply an elemental debuff, whose potency increases the more break effect you build. Funny enough, this means that against 40% FRES bosses, break debuffs have a 10% chance to whiff if you don't build any effect hit rate. Though with an EHR guarantee requirement of just 11.2%, you really aren't intended to miss. Dealing toughness damage while an enemy's weakness broken, and you have one or more of these enablers on the field, deals super break damage based on the overkill toughness damage dealt. Here are the precise formulas for break damage and super break damage. All you need to understand is that both types of damage don't scale off of the usual attack damage and crit buffs, and work out better if your attacks deal high toughness damage. High toughness damage lets you access break and super break damage sooner, and while it doesn't directly increase the break damage you deal, it does directly increase how much super break damage you deal. As such, it's in the best interest for breakers to increase their toughness damage as high as possible, but because all attacks start off with a fixed toughness damage value, there's only 3 ways to increase it. Increasing the number of hits, which is usually locked behind Eidolons or RNG, increasing the attack's toughness reduction, which is only applied as self-buffs as of right now by 7 characters, and increasing the attack's weakness break efficiency, which 4 characters apply as self-buffs, while just 2 other characters can buff other characters' weakness break efficiency, Ron Mei and E1 Fugue. Considering how scarce these toughness increasing methods are, how half of them are locked behind Eidolons, and how only 2 characters to this day buff it for others, it's pretty clear that Hoyo wants to control how much toughness damage each character does. It's also why whenever break-focused fights roll around, Ron Mei is still almost always an auto-include, being one of the only 2 characters in the game to increase weakness break efficiency, and the only one to apply it team-wide and at E0 no less. Speaking of break-focused fights, Apocalyptic Shadow is particularly interesting when it comes to how break damage is calculated. See, initial breaks are actually still treated as happening while the character is not in the weakness broken state, meaning that they still go through the 0.9 times non-broken multiplier, as well as Steadfast Safeguard's 50% damage reduction for non-broken bosses. The only way to land breaks is that ignore these damage reduction mechanics is via Fugue, who automatically applies Exo-Toughness, which is technically called Cloud Flame Luster in her case, but I'll be referring to it as Exo-Toughness as it's just easier to say. Exo-Toughness, for those that aren't aware, is an extra toughness bar possessing 40% of the original toughness, in Fugue's case, that appears after you break. Breaking the Exo-Toughness bar deals the exact same damage as breaking the toughness bar, except since the enemy is treated as weakness broken when Exo-Toughness is up, you gain access to the full 1 times damage multiplier versus weakness broken enemies, plus the double damage broken multiplier present in Apocalyptic Shadow. Oh, and that attack deals super break damage too. This means that Exo-Breaks are capable of dealing anywhere from 1.1 to 8.8 times more damage than breaks, depending on the scenario, which can of course be a very, very big deal, and is one of the less obvious reasons why Fugue is an auto-include in break-focused archetypes. Do also note that super break damage gets calculated after all forms of damage, so if an enemy dies from break damage, the super break damage they take won't be registered as part of the damage dealt. This is mostly a visual change though, as it only comes into play when considering Kirby's E1 and Finon's E6 if you're crazy enough to play in Super Break, I guess. And one last addendum about Super Break damage before I wrap up. Any hit versus an enemy that has any amount of toughness left cannot deal Super Break damage. This is relevant because all characters' attack can be broken up into a certain number of hits that each deal a varying percentage of the total toughness, which you can find on the official HSR wiki. And the hit that breaks an enemy's toughness, even if that hit dealt more toughness than the amount to break, deals 0 super break damage. For example, Firefly's enhanced skill deals 60 toughness damage with Ranmei's help, but that damage is distributed like so. If the enemy has, let's say, 40 toughness left, the first 4 hits will deal 36 toughness damage, bringing the enemy down to 4 toughness. Now, normally you'd expect the final hit, which deals 24 toughness, to break the enemy and convert the remaining 20 toughness to super break damage, but since the final hit is landing against an enemy that has yet to be weakness broken, the enemy will just be broken and 0 super break damage will be dealt. This damage distribution, therefore, means that in order for this Firefly to deal any super break damage, the enemy has to have at most 36 toughness remaining, rather than just any value under 60. So, with all that information in mind, what are Break's best matchups? Just to clarify, when I refer to Break, I'll mainly be referring to the trio of limited break DPS, Boothill, Firefly, and Rappa plus their supports. I'll also bring up DPS options such as Himeko, Xueyi, and Hunt March when relevant, but they won't be the main focus of this video. The first and most important thing to be looking out for in favorable matchups is matching elements. For other archetypes, like Crit, not bringing the right weakness types causes them to deal less damage due to type resistance, as well as miss out on a potential 11% bonus multiplier from being unable to break their enemies. This bonus multiplier for Crit, however, is a mandatory 100% multiplier that Break loses out on if they're unable to break. This is why they rely so much more on having the right weaknesses on the enemy, and why having weakness implants is so important for them. Rather than being an unfair advantage, especially when implants not named Silverwolves don't reduce elemental res for said enemies, it's the bare minimum needed to play off element. Boothill has his physical implant restricted to his first skill and 2-turn ultimates, a rotation which also depends on him breaking weaknesses, so if he's killing one mob a turn, then eventually there will be times where he's forced to rely on enemies naturally being physical weak. Otherwise, he'll have gaps with 1 to 2 turns where no enemies are on element for him. Combined with his initial ramp-up period, given how low his toughness damage without any pocket trick shots at the start of battle drops, with his enhanced basics dealing 2.5 times less toughness than they normally do, an issue that is conveniently somewhat mitigated with his E1, this drastically slows down his performance. Even Firefly, who implants fire weakness on every single enhanced skill, as well as at the beginning of each wave for 2 turns, has times where not fighting naturally fire weak enemies really hurts her performance. Because her skill's implant is only single target, if new enemies spawn that aren't fire weak, her adjacent blast toughness against them drops severely. Sure, she's a bit better off than Boothill, in that she still deals 55% of her original toughness, but that doesn't amount to very much. Factoring in herself 50% weakness break efficiency, along with Ranmei, she hits a grand total of 16.5 toughness, not enough to break most mobs that start off at 20 or more. And in her E6, or E1 Fugue, sure, she crosses a 20 toughness breakpoint, but what do you do when non-fire weak mobs with 30 or even 40 toughness start showing up? Even with all 3 possible sources of weakness break efficiency, plus another 50% more, she still can't even one-shot break the 30 toughness bubble hounds off element. Not even the highest possible vertical investment money can buy lets you completely ignore weakness types. And, well, certainly, Rappa's no better off element either. 50% toughness penalty and no imaginary implants means that even against a target where she focuses both of her first 2 hits, she's only hitting 29 toughness with Ranmei, 19 toughness on adjacent enemies, and 9 toughness to everyone else. Thankfully, she gains 1 additional AoE toughness per break up to 10 that doesn't even go through the 50% toughness penalty, so breaking at least 1 enemy before her final hit lets her reach the much more useful 30 main, 20 adjacent, 10 all else toughness breakpoint. However, even at her 10 stack cap, her enhanced basic can still miss out on those crucial 40 and 30 toughness mob breakpoints. You can fix this with E1 Fugue, or mitigate it by targeting different enemies to spread out the break damage, but do keep in mind that it's very rare to be hitting this 10 stack cap in the first place. Breaking 5 mobs in one go just really isn't a thing anymore, with Pure Fiction's waves 2 and 3 having one big bad with a much larger toughness and HP bar. Not to mention that getting 2 stacks requires not only breaks, but Exo-Breaks on top of that, which is an additional 40% of the original toughness, which is way too much for Rappa to disintegrate off element in one go. To further illustrate how big of a deal being on element is for Break, Xueyi's ults and follow-ups ignore weakness types, and yet despite this, because her skill is actually capable of dealing just as much toughness damage as her ult versus 3 targets, and is online 3 times as often, she's still relying on quantum weakness, because Xueyi could be generating follow-ups up to 4 times slower if she's forced to play off element. There's also the fact that quantum weakness just enables her best in slot and 4-piece quantum too. You'd really be surprised how borderline unusable Xueyi is when no enemies are quantum weak, despite being a near-perfect colorless DPS. And of course, Himeko with her measly 10 toughness follow-ups is very dependent on fire weakness, as well as whatever type her sub-DPS is, be it Ice for Herta or Imaginary for Harmony MC, to name a few, to constantly chain her follow-ups back to back. And on that note, it's not just the DPS types that need to match up, there's a great deal of importance in ensuring that the supports weakness types match as well. Lots of great break supports are great in part because they help reduce toughness, and unlike the main break DPS, they usually don't have access to weakness implants or attacks that ignore weakness types. This means that sometimes, matching elements is arguably even more important for your supports than for your DPS. So the question of course becomes, which elements are the best for enabling break supports? Generally, if you're running a break sustain like Linshot or Gallagher, fire weakness is king. Sure, Firefly can implant fire weakness, but because it's only E at the start of every wave and single target otherwise, you'd only want to rely on it playing versus a single phase or a single target focused fight. Since outside of those scenarios, Gallagher's and especially Linshot's AoE attacks won't have any fire weak enemies to hit. Honorable mention to enabling Kalpagni for everyone on the team as well. A slightly better Talia with 6% speed is always appreciated. Technically, Asta and Xiao Cho are niche support picks that also benefit from fire weak content, but Asta, despite having a team-wide speed buff and the ability to hold DDD, is usually too SP hungry to be used properly, not to mention her bounce skills mean she loses effectiveness in AoE content. As for Xiao Cho, take it from someone who's used him for this very purpose myself, unless you're in a very low toughness fight, he's a Gallagher side grade for someone who's unfortunately not a healer. Rather, for your pure ampers, Quantum is your best bet, since it enables Cypher, Tribby, and Silverwolf, top tier quantum break supports, in single target, AoE, and mixed, respectively. If your DPS is playing on element, then sure, Silverwolf can stick herself in the first slot and apply quantum weakness herself, especially given how strong her amp is. But just like E0 Firefly, each of her implants is not free and costs an SP to use, not to mention that it's basically impossible to place quantum weakness on every single enemy to benefit from her AoE ult. Long story short, it's just a lot easier and usually less SP intensive to use Silverwolf as a break support if the stage itself is already mostly quantum weak. Falling behind a decent margin is Imaginary weak, purely because of Harmony MC. Hunt March can work, but she's less dependent on Imaginary weakness due to also adopting her Shifu's damage type. And well, truthfully, she's not a break support at heart. Her frequent attacks and action advance make her much better suited as a crit sub-DPS with Robin, especially since she only buffs DPS with 60% break effect, the one stat break DPS are most saturated on. Ice Weak is next up, but not because of Ron Mei, who at most uses 2 measly basics every 3 turns, and even less of trying to maintain 2-turn ult uptime. It's actually because of everyone's favorite 1.0 pre-Ron Mei generalist, Pela, with their useful defense shred tied to a spammable AoE ult. RMC would also be decent if they didn't have such fierce competition with their Harmony counterpart, but perhaps it's for the better that as more of a generalist, they don't outclass their Harmony niche support. Shout out to Misha, who was part of some very funny zero-cycle cooks, purely for his ability to shred Aventuring's toughness, freeze him, and apply a bit of defense down in the process. And now for the less honorable mentions. Besides Quantum, Win has the most potentially viable break supports, though they lack the same level of amp. Black Swan and Anaxa provide good to insane toughness damage, but very poor damage amp. Hyacine provides decent frequent chip toughness, but having 0 amp without her S1 means she usually gets outclassed by her fellow break amp sustains anyways. And Ceridra has decent Firefly synergy, both at E0 for free extra skills without consuming SP, and at E2 for more frequent double skills, but her scaling attack buff is coded to not work with Firefly's attack to break effect conversion, just like how Robin's scaling attack buff doesn't work either, meaning that she only adds an extra plus 20 speed and 10% skill res pen during coup de main. Teridra also straight up just doesn't work with Boothill, and Rappa's power is in her enhanced basics, not her skills, which she ideally never wants to use anyways. The jury is still out regarding her synergy with Xueyi at least, as enabling double skills is legitimately strong for her. Physical actually has a semi-decent break support option now with Hysolins, with her defense down and vulnerability providing generally good amp, AoE attacks, and her ult refunding 1 SP per use. Other options are less great though. Hanya is just a more SP positive but weaker single target version of Asta, and Luca is just there to retrigger break bleeds. A subpar but fun addition to a Boothill comp, or a Boothill at home if you prefer playing him that way. And Lightning? Yeah, there's nothing. So as far as weaknesses go, having your DPS be on element is obviously ideal. After taking that into consideration though, Fire, Quantum, and Imaginary are by far the best supports-wise, with Ice being decent, and then Wind, Physical, and especially Lightning at the very bottom. The second thing to look out for to determine Break's matchup strength is, well, how much toughness the enemies have. However, it's not quite as straightforward as less is better, more is worse, or vice versa, since dealing maximum break damage requires high toughness, while maximum super break damage requires low toughness. And unfortunately, pretty much every single break DPS scales off of both. Even Boothill most of the time, as Fugue is an auto-include on 99% of his teams. Instead, it might be better to ask these questions. 1. What's the highest toughness value my DPS can break in one turn? This will usually determine the upper limit for mob toughness you want to see in battle. The closer you get to that limit, the better. Generally though, this limit will usually be between 20 and 40 versus groups of on-element enemies, or 50 to 100 if only aiming versus a single target. Doesn't always happen nowadays, but it's still possible every once in a while. You can also map out how much toughness your team can deal in one rotation, and compare that against the boss's toughness, to figure out the maximum boss toughness that's acceptable for you. Most break teams will prefer bosses in the 100 to 150 toughness range generally speaking. Keep in mind that having access to offensive support ults can raise these thresholds by minimum 20 to 30 toughness, or 30 to 45 with Ron May. Having an Eagle set support to cut ahead of your DPS is also a common zero cycle tactic to pair with that ult for another skill usage for even more toughness. For example, there's a reason that Tribi is pretty much mandatory versus Reaver for break zero cycles, and it has everything to do with its 40 to 60 toughness quantum weak summons. Question 2. How many waves or phases do I have to clear? In general, 2 waves is a sweet spot, while 1-phase bosses are best for super break DPS, and 2-phase bosses are best for break DPS. First, both Boothill and Rappa rely on gaining momentum through breaks and kills, meaning that they need low HP mobs to get going, enemies that tend to only appear during multi-wave content. While this is true for E2 Firefly in the same way, who also has a slight reliance on breaks and kills, she also generally likes entering wave 2 with her ult immediately active instead of waiting a turn, meaning that she has ramp up even at E0. There's also the often ignored fact that her technique is affected by weakest break efficiency boosts from her ult, Ron May in E1 Fugue, but due to how technique priority works, not even Ron May's preloaded skill fires off before Firefly's technique attack, making her wave 1 toughness reduction a bit weaker than you'd think. However, add too many waves or phases, and all of a sudden your character can be wasting too much time trying to break enemies instead of, dealing break damage. Boothill, with his high single target toughness and heavy break damage reliance, is best suited to deal with double toughness bar bosses, but still hates wasting his shots. On the opposite end though, Rappa suffers from lots of high toughness bars the most, with her low base toughness if she isn't constantly breaking. Sure, AS Sunday for example is fine for Rappa, what with so many low toughness side imaginary break bars that constantly regen to help her and her team loop action advances across the fight, but the fact stands that even compared to this ultra favorable case, she'd still prefer to face a regular old choir. This is why Rappa really doesn't do well in off-element pure fiction. An AoE break DPS with not enough toughness to hit one-shot breakpoints can't maintain the perpetual DDD ult looping chain that defines his ideal playstyle. Overall then, 2-phase bosses are the best happy medium for break DPS, with the exception of Choir, whose toughness is so low that it's lower than just the 3 elites separately. 2-phase bosses also tend to have higher toughnesses. Beyond Hule featured here, Nikador, Meme, and Flame Reaver all have 240 toughness, and all of them are two-phase bosses. Heck, Liga sets this new record for single-phase toughness bars, and yet he only has 200 toughness. This means that the more a DPS relies on break, the more they like to see higher toughness as well as more break bars. Of course, new bosses could buck this pattern, but consistently it's been the case that break DPS favor two-phase bosses, while super break DPS favor one-phase bosses. And the third thing to check when determining good break matchups, what do I gain from breaking the enemy? The benefits of breaking can be offensive, as a lot of version 2 enemies have incorporated. Shell of Fated Rage trades a 60% damage reduction when not broken, for 50% vulnerability when it is broken. Past, Present, and Future loses 15% of its max HP and gains 50% Vault if it's completely broken. Apocalyptic Shadow, removing Steadfast Safeguards, 50% damage reduction when not broken, and trades it for 100% vulnerability when broken. You get the picture. However, the benefits of breaking can also be defensive, since, well, broken enemies can't attack, meaning no dangerous or annoying CCs to worry about. Svarog, for instance, can't delay your actions or use his hand to steal an ally if he's broken. And if you can break the Aruanton Gatekeeper before it locks its toughness, then it can't exactly inflict massive single target damage and imprisons to your party either. However, you can also lose things from breaking the enemy, which is a sign of a bad matchup. The aforementioned Gatekeeper, when it locks its toughness, also spawns 2 Dragonfish, which deal a small amount of damage, and more importantly, 30% AoE defense down to all enemies for 2 turns upon death. Break the Gatekeeper too early, and the Dragonfish never spawn. You can't rely on their 60% defense down to boost your damage anymore. You might also rely on hit energy, like with the Howling Caskets, whose first Moonrage attack gives 20 AoE energy at the small cost of 500 chip damage. Breaking the casket too early prevents that hit energy from being received by your team. And of course, you might rely on summons that are spawned on the enemy's turns. True Sting spawns deal 3 to 6% of the boss's HP as AoE when they die, as well as inflicting 10% to 20% AoE vulnerability, stacking up to 100%. Killing Nikador's Pillars deals 50% max HP to him per pillar killed, for a total of 60% max HP across each wave of 4 pillars. And Reaver loses 5% of his max HP and 5% of his 40% initial damage reduction per vessel killed, spawning up to 4 at a time. If you break these bosses too early, they don't spawn their summons, thus locking you out of potential damage that you would have had if you didn't break them instead. Of course, that alone doesn't make these matches impossible. After all, they get a pretty much guaranteed turn in Phase 2, which they will always spend on spawning their summons, and you can always time your breaks to be immediately after their summons too. It's just something to keep in mind when determining how favorable a matchup is for break. And with that said, thanks for watching. Hopefully you picked up something new from this video. Originally I was going to make this one long yap fest where I go into Break's problems as well as potential ideas on how to buff its characters, but after thinking about it, I think it makes more sense to split them up into more digestible chunks. After all, even this video script is over 4,000 words and it's only a third of what I have written down. Don't worry though, I'll do my best to make sure each video is watchable on its own, though if you want to watch all 3 of them in order, let's just say that I'm not opposed to the idea. Let me know if you have any comments or suggestions, and as always, have a great day.